Greetings and welcome to the March on Washington Film Festival. I'm Artistic Director Isisara Bey. We begin by acknowledging the source of all life and the seven directions: north, south, east, west, above, below, and within, and to the cycle of life of African ancestor people, those who have gone on before, those living, and those yet to be born. Because they were, we are. Because we are, they will be. Our 2020 theme is Who Tells the Story? It is inspired by the African proverb, until the lion learns to write, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. This theme urges us to research the authentic and overlooked voices of history, to underscore how those voices and stories have been mistold, and open space for each of us to be self-determined in telling our own story. The March on Washington Film Festival gets to do this work because of the generosity of our sponsors and donors. We especially thank the Mellon Foundation, T-Mobile, Variety, AT&T, and David Frederick, and Sophia Lynn. James Baldwin and William F. Buckley are two who told the story of their America through their writings and lectures. Those stories were diametrically opposed, as exemplified in the famous debate between the two at the Cambridge Union in 1965. As individuals with conflicting ideas about race, they represented the prevailing points of view on the subject. We are reimagining that debate today so that we may explore how far or how little we have traveled since then. Leading this reimagining is Nicholas Buckley, author of The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, and the Debate Over Race in America. He is also the author of The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass in Pursuit of American Liberty. He is the Elizabeth and Morris Glickman Chair in Political Science and founding director of the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice at Linfield University in Oregon. We are honored to have him with us. Nick will provide an historical overview and interview our presenters. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Isisara. It's my honor to serve as the moderator for this event, Buckley v. Baldwin Reimagined. I want to take us back to get us started 55 years ago, February 18th, 1965. You have the Cambridge Union, the world's oldest debating society, one of the world's most prestigious debating societies. This space, the debating chamber, which is modeled after the British House of Commons, was filled with students. So many students were in that space that the debaters, when they entered the hall, had to step over the legs of students who were sitting on the floors. There were more students in overflow rooms on the Union premises that night. And those students were packed into the Union, this 150-year-old institution. They were packed in there mostly to see James Baldwin, who was one of the great literary celebrities in the world at the time. Baldwin was, in the words of his friend Malcolm X, the poet of the Civil Rights Revolution. And by that, Malcolm meant that Baldwin was the leading literary figure associated with the movement that was at that moment transforming the world. Baldwin was there to square off, though, against a leading conservative opponent of that Civil Rights Revolution, William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley was about, as Isisara just noted, about as different from Baldwin as you can imagine. They were born in the same city, New York City, but they may as well have been born on different planets. Baldwin was a son of Harlem who describes the experiences of domination that his family had to survive in the 20s and 30s. And Buckley was a son of privilege who grew up on a 47-acre estate. Baldwin, in his writings, fiction, nonfiction, every genre you can imagine, really tried to get at what lies beneath so much of what ails the American soul. And he says, if you want to understand American racism, you have to figure out what is it, these graver questions of self. What is it that is tormenting us as individuals, that leads us to treat one another inhumanely. And so Baldwin, in all of his writings, is trying to get at that, and the Cambridge debate was certainly an example of him doing this. Buckley was also a prolific writer. That's one thing they had in common. Buckley was the editor of National Review magazine, a magazine that's still around, a really important tribune of American conservatism. He was the author of a thrice weekly newspaper column. He was a talking head on the conservative side, leading champion of the Barry Goldwater candidacy for the presidency. Buckley was really a founding father of the American conservative movement. And so on this night, February 18th, 1965, you have this giant of the Civil Rights Revolution and this giant of the American conservative movement squaring off on this international stage at the high tide of the Civil Rights movement. We're right in the midst of the Selma campaign for voting rights. And so Baldwin and Buckley are there that night to square off. And that debate, there's a BBC recording of that debate that everyone should check out. It's part of the film festival materials. And that night, Baldwin really delivers a sermon about the perils of white supremacy. He was a young minister, and in some ways, he never left the pulpit. He delivers a sermon about the perils of white supremacy, not only for its obvious victims, but for those who are its would-be beneficiaries. And so Baldwin delivers this 24-minute sermon that night. And then Buckley speaks, and Buckley delivers a speech in which he warns the audience about Baldwin's dangerous radicalism, and says that Baldwin is there to overthrow the faith of their fathers. And so Buckley ultimately makes this argument, which he'd been making for over a decade at the time, about the dangers of the Civil Rights Revolution, the ways in which the Civil Rights Revolution threatened to upset nothing less than Western civilization. Now that night, 55 years ago, Baldwin prevailed. He won by a vote of 544 to 164. The motion before the House that night was the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. That was the motion that the Cambridge Union presented Baldwin and Buckley with. And Baldwin's side won 544 to 164. But in the 55 years since, as Isisara just noted, one of the questions is, did Baldwin win that battle and lose a larger war for the American soul? And so what we are doing here with this event is we are reimagining that debate. And we have with us two leading public intellectuals. We have a modified motion, and our motion is the American dream is at the expense of African Americans. And we have with us Khalil Gibran Muhammad and David Frum, two leading public intellectuals that I'll tell you more about in due course, and also two members of the Champion Howard University debate team who will play the role of cross-examining Professor Muhammad and Mr. Frum. So our format will be Mr. Muhammad will speak first for about 10 or 15 minutes, then Mr. Frum will speak, and then Mr. Muhammad will be subject to cross-examination, and then Mr. Frum will be subject to cross-examination. So I think it's going to be a really wonderful event. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Professor Muhammad. Professor Muhammad is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. He's the former director of one of my favorite places in the world, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library. He is the award-winning author of a book everyone should acquire right away if they don't already have a copy, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, and a contributor to a 2014 National Research Council study, The Growth of Incarceration in the United States, Exploring Causes and Consequences. Welcome, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be part of this historic reenactment. I am a huge fan of James Baldwin, of course, and so I'm grateful that I haven't drawn this side of the debate to imagine how Baldwin might make the case in 2020. I just want to say to the organizers of the March on Washington Film Festival how much I appreciate the work that they do, to Nicholas for writing an amazing book, The Fire is Upon Us, and as well to my colleague David Frum for his willingness to be part of this and for the work that he has done to help us think through the unique moment in history we are in. The American dream is still at the expense of the American Negro. We are in a period of the greatest economic inequality and stratification in the nation's history. 1% of the population takes home 20% of the income and own 35% of the wealth. Real income and wages in relation to inflation have stagnated for the vast majority of Americans for decades. And only a deluded person would suggest that this inequality doesn't come at the expense of the most exploited members of our society. The white deaths of despair from alcohol, methamphetamine, heroin, opioid, suicides are, we are constantly told, the consequences of the failed hopes of these downtrodden, hardworking Americans. The promises of the dream for them and their children, now an American nightmare. And yet, how can it be that the nation on all political sides is going to great lengths to improve the economic fortunes of working class and rural white Americans if the dream is simultaneously working today for Black people? Indeed, the racist scapegoating of Black radicals and brown immigrants by the racist in chief makes visible that Blackness is indeed the brick and mortar that binds the nation together. The nation, moreover, cannot have it both ways. On one hand, expressing great sympathy and consternation and the promises of economic stimulus and recovery for the heartland, and yet Black people, we are often heard and told, must work harder, have fewer children, get married, and earn their way to the American dream. Since 1968, Black babies survive childbirth nearly 70% more often. Black people live 11.5 years longer over the course of those past 50 years. The Black high school graduation rate has nearly doubled from 54% to 92% completion rate. And now a quarter of Black people graduate from college, whereas less than 10% did 50 years ago. This is the kind of good news over the past 50 years that passes as racial progress in a land that is all too often willing to celebrate its exceptionalism at the expense of the truth of the complexities of how the nation actually functions. Because in most categories of economic health, disparities have in fact grown. Today, American women in the aggregate die in childbirth at a higher rate than any other developed country. And yet for non-Hispanic Black women, they died even 3 times greater than their white counterparts. Their maternal death is itself a crisis of our time. The median hourly wage for whites is $19.23 versus $15.80 for Blacks, a gap that has in fact grown 10 basis points over the past half century. With median household income, for example, the average white family brings home $65,000 as compared to $45,000 for Black families, a gap that has also grown slightly in 50 years. As for wealth, the net assets, when we subtract out everything, all the extraction that goes on in our consumer-driven society, white wealth sits at $171,000 as compared to $17,000 for Black folks, a 10-fold gap that used to be 5-fold in 1968. Home ownership rates are 71% for white families versus 41% for Black families. 41% Black home ownership rate is the exact same percentage as it was in 1968. The temporary gains of the 1990s and 2000s wiped out by the systematic exploitation of first-time Black homebuyers. Whites, in the meantime, increased their home ownership rates from 65% to 71%. One of my colleagues, Raj Chetty, a leading economist of inequality in America, notes that children born in 1940 had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents, but for children born in the 1980s, that chance had fallen to 50%, a toss of a coin. In other words, the world that we've seen since that fateful debate in 1965 has grown stingier and indeed more systematically racist. Because we know that the white boys from wealthy families remain wealthy, or at least part of an upper middle class as adults. But Black children who come from rich households will not. Indeed, a Black boy born to a wealthy family is more than twice as likely to end up poor as a white boy from a wealthy family. Additional data shows that 21% of Black men raised at the very bottom were incarcerated, according to a snapshot on a single day as reported in the New York Times during the 2010 census. Black men raised in the top 1% by actual Black millionaires today, often held up as exemplars of American exceptionalism. Those Black children in the 1% were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning about $36,000. And finally, the worst places for poor white children in America today are almost all better than the best places for poor Black children. In effect, the worst places for whites produce outcomes that are about as good as the best places for Blacks. Dr. King, like Baldwin, lived beyond the civil rights movement, stepped into the future that we often celebrate for having brought us to, certainly as recently as the last presidency, a kind of fictive post-racial America. But Dr. King left us with some parting thoughts before his untimely murder in 1968. He noted in his final work that there is a congenital deformity of racism that has crippled the nation from its inception. The roots of racism are very deep in America. Historically, it was so acceptable in the national life that today it still only lightly burdens the conscious. The today for him was 1968, not a distant past. No one surveying the moral landscape of our nation can overlook the hideous and pathetic wreckage of commitment twisted and turned to 1,000 shapes under the stress of prejudice and irrationality. Another observer who lived long enough to be a contemporary of Baldwin well into the era of post-civil rights described the conditions of anti-Black oppression in the nation's ghettos of the 1960s as an internal colony. Failing schools, underfunded hospitals, toxic water, occupying police forces, as Kenneth Clark noted in Dark Ghettos, all done by design. But he left us with an important metaphor for our time. This idea of an internal colony as a structure built for extraction seems to be a useful way to reflect upon this American dream. Because as much as we might celebrate progress by how we might index the representation of Black millionaires who can be counted on all our fingers and toes, or even today, like Beyonce and Jay-Z, a couple more Black billionaires. The truth is that Black elites have consistently functioned in a way of being colonial managers for the extraction process, both in the United States and abroad. These Black elites stand in, as we see in the Facebook of 922 powerful positions as reported in the New York Times just recently, of which only a tiny fraction, particularly in the private sector, counting less than 3%, are actually Black faces. But they loom large in the collective imagination. They loom large in the stories that we tell about how far we've come in a nation so bent on wealth creation at all costs. Because it turns out that the National Research Council, the nation's leading scientific body that periodically asks tough questions about how to measure change in our society, noted in a 1989 report that ultimately, because of the political and social activism among Black Americans leading to the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s, that government policies had in fact changed, and that private institutions were leaning into redressing the past of their own discrimination. They noted in 1989 that the greatest gains for Blacks had occurred between the 1940s and the 1960s. And yet, since the early 1970s, after the debate between Baldwin and Buckley, the economic status of Blacks relative to whites has, on average, they noted, stagnated or deteriorated. We now know so much more about the historical function of redlining in our nation's past, that it is still with us, that we can see maps today and overlay that the 60% of redlined communities across America, when the federal government began in the 1930s to codify the statutory rules of exclusion that had kept white neighborhoods for whites only, except the redistribution mechanisms of government policy now aided and abetted that inequality, made possible an American dream of affluent, or most certainly better off suburbs that Black people were systematically excluded from. Many of those same communities, as has been documented on Long Island in New York or in the Boston area, and in so many other annual audits of housing, reflect the steering practices of racial discrimination today that still keep those communities as white as possible. The subprime lending crisis that gave us the Great Recession was itself a form of deliberate and by design ways of pricing Black people higher as riskier investments to extract from them for the purposes of creating financial profits for the well-to-do. We know, for example, that it was the practice of the Wells Fargo offices, where one who was a witness to this says he worked, and that they targeted African Americans for subprime loans. It was generally assumed that African American customers were less sophisticated and intelligent and could be manipulated more easily into a subprime loan with expensive terms than white customers. We continue to see the divestment in public housing policy, predatory inclusion programs where private sector programs that are funded by the federal government renovate and sell dilapidated, unlivable homes to low-income buyers only to extract profit from transaction fees. Gentrification brings criminalization and displacement to the people who have long suffered from divestment of their communities, now moved out to make way for more affluent and overwhelmingly white residents. In the education system, segregation has returned with a vengeance, reaching a high water point of desegregation up until about the 1980s. And if we look around the nation today, we see that the problem of racial segregation, the very problem that civil rights activists centered in their work of making America a more egalitarian, racially just place, looks about the same as it did in the 1960s. We know from Jefferson County, Alabama, to Brooklyn and New York and Manhattan that white parents look inside classrooms to count the presence of Black people as evidence of whether they want their own child to be in that environment. Because in the end, it is easier for people to imagine a meritocracy for their own children and something quite different for other people's children. It's also important to know that what Baldwin or King could not imagine in the construction of the criminal justice system has produced the greatest system of unfreedom the world has ever known. By population, by per capita incarceration rates, and by expenditures, the United States exceeds all other nations in how many of its citizens, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants are under some form of criminal justice supervision. The number of African American and Latinx people in American jails and prisons today exceeds the entire populations of some African, Eastern European, and Caribbean countries. The United States didn't get to mass incarceration without mass participation in the criminalization of Black and brown people by liberals and conservatives, Northerners and Southerners, Republicans and Democrats, whites, and yes, some Blacks. And so in an $80 billion system that drains resources from the public goods that build healthy and secure lives, from education to healthcare, it is deeply rooted in the white supremacist and capitalist logics of containment and extraction today. This has been a form of economic development in rural parts of the country, bringing jobs for working class white men, from police lines to prison guards, for fees and fines from municipalities to over-surveil and over-police low-income Black communities. Professional prestige has brought the American dream for prosecutors and judges who've made their bones literally on the backs of criminalizing the poor and Black in this nation. My colleague Ruthie Gilmore calls this organized abandonment and organized violence of Black neighborhoods against Black people. And we know the Kerner Commission report called this out for what it was in 1968, noting that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. But then President Johnson turned his back on the report, and Nixon ran on a Southern strategy, therefore taking the idea that you could actually weaponize Black people, as John Ehrlichman admitted decades later. noting that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And today, as we look out on the landscape of pattern and practice investigations and federal consent decrees of police brutality from cities as far-ranging as Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, Detroit, New Orleans, Seattle, Albuquerque, New York, Portland, Baltimore, we see countless men and women and children, cis, trans, and queer folk who have been harmed consistently with the long arm of the law and the short baton of brutality time and time again. The end of the civil rights movement did not bring an end to racism, to plunder, and to political race baiting. White supremacy and racial capitalism evolved during the post-civil rights era. We see in this year's presidential race the long legacy of blackface playing out not in burnt cork on the vaudeville stage or in the medical yearbook of the current governor of Virginia, but in competing Super Bowl ads for Donald Trump and former Democratic primary contender Michael Bloomberg. Both spent $5.5 million in ads in an effort to define the future of the nation around the image of Black women. Such was on display in the conventions last month. Blackness has always and continues to serve as a form of cultural, economic, and political currency to further the aims of white leaders whose own identity and sense of exceptionalism is defined in relation to, as Baldwin would say, the Negro. In the 1979 unpublished manuscript, Remember This House, Baldwin wrote this: "I know very well that my ancestors had no desire to come to this place, but neither did the ancestors of the people who became white and who require of my captivity a song. They require a song of me less to celebrate my captivity than to justify their own." He continued, "This Negro problem, which they invented in order to safeguard their purity, has made of them criminals and monsters, and it is destroying them. And this not from anything Blacks may or may not be doing, but because of the role of a guilty and constricted white imagination as assigned to the Blacks. No other country can afford to dream of a Plymouth automobile and a wife in a house with a fence and the children growing up safely to go to college and to become executives and then to marry and have the Plymouth and the house and so forth. A great many people do not live this way and cannot imagine it and do not know that when we talk about democracy, this is what we mean. This is never about the conditions of life for Black people per se, this American dream. The currency is whiteness, and that whiteness can be beneficent and malevolent, but it is always centering itself. It is co-opting and appropriating. These Black bodies are the nutrients of the fertile soil that produces the wealth of the richest nation. These bodies belong to the workers whose lives are both essential and expendable. This is a tale retold over and over again, only the latest chapters written in the first reports of death from the deadly coronavirus. I say not only is the American dream still at the expense of the Negro, there is no American dream without the image and presence of Black people to keep the competing needs, wants, and desires of whites from tearing each other apart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. Our next speaker will be Mr. David Frum. He will be opposing the motion. Mr. Frum is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of 10 books. Most recently, another one everyone ought to pick up, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. Mr. Frum has worked at a number of leading conservative institutions, including the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the Manhattan Institute, the American Enterprise Institute. From 2014 to 2017, he served as chairman of the board of trustees of the leading UK center-right think tank Policy Exchange. In 2001 and 2002, Mr. Frum served as speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush. David Frum's first book, Dead Right, which was published in 1994, won praise from none other than the late William F. Buckley Jr. And Buckley called it the most refreshing intellectual experience in a generation. Mr. Frum.
Thank you so much. And it is indeed a tremendous honor to be here and to follow Professor Muhammad. As As you say, I did know Bill Buckley. We were not friends. We were not contemporaries. I knew him. I loved him. I never had the honor to meet James Baldwin, but I have met him and admired him. So I'm conscious of the magnitude of the shoes that it falls on me to not fill. But I want to take us back to that moment in 1965. Watch again the video of the original Baldwin-Buckley debate, and you'll notice something strange. As those two great writers argued whether the American dream had come at the expense of Black people, neither of them troubled to explain what they meant by the American dream. Baldwin, midway through his speech, promised that he would do it, but never got around to it. Buckley disregarded the phrase altogether. So I invite you today to think harder about those words that went unexamined in 1965. The American dream doesn't mean the American standard of living. It doesn't mean American public policy as it exists at any moment. It doesn't even mean American civilization, the phrase that Bill Buckley preferred in 1965 instead of the words in the debate resolution. The man who coined the phrase, the American dream, almost a century ago, a writer named James Truslow Adams, defined what he meant by the dream in language we should recall today. Adams wrote that the American dream was a dream of, quote, a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. Adams did not dismiss the importance of material abundance, but the opportunity Adams valued was opportunity in every dimension: moral, cultural, intellectual, spiritual, artistic, as well as material. In Adams's words, and here I'm quoting again, a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attend to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. Once you absorb the full radical challenge of Adams's concept of the American dream, then you realize that today's resolution, the American dream is at the expense of African Americans, is not merely wrong. It is absolutely upside down. Adams again. Each man, each woman, to achieve their fullest development in every direction. It's the dream of a world built for all, not for some. The dream does not promise that everyone will succeed equally. The dream is not socialist. The dream does not promise that everybody will or can or should become rich or famous. That's the false allure of celebrity culture. The dream promises the removal of every obstacle that prevents people from developing as themselves and being respected for themselves. In American history, Black Americans have lived an experience of the most brutal and dehumanizing subordination. That history must be taught, must be understood, and must be memorialized. But the language of this resolution dangerously misjudges how that subordination was imposed and how it has been overcome to the extent that it has been overcome. The American dream spoken of in this resolution has not been bought at the expense of Black Americans. It is measured against the experience of Black Americans. Black Americans are not the dream's victims. Black Americans are the dream's test. That's as true today as it was in 1965. But much else has changed. Above all, this. When the debate was staged in February 1965, Black Americans lacked much, maybe almost everything, in the way of power. In much of the country, they could not vote. They were excluded from the highest offices of politics, business, the law, education, media, the military, the police. Their spending power was limited. Their cultural power was ghettoized. In 2020, by contrast, Black power is not a shouted slogan. It is an all-present fact of American society that must be taken into account by every decision maker everywhere. Yet this resolution rephrases for 2020 in language barely changed from 55 years ago, the pessimism that James Baldwin expressed in his speaking and writing in 1965. It tells Black Americans America is not for you. Such a message teaches only despair, and despair breeds helplessness, passivity, and submission. We are holding this debate at a season when all the hopes of American democracy depend on efforts by everyone who cherishes the promise of this country. Your commitment, your determination will decide the outcome of the coming contest. You are needed. You are needed now. It is America that needs you, and it is America that has a right to ask you. Rewatch the debate from 1965 or read the transcript, and you will see Baldwin and Buckley agreeing on one shared dismal premise. They both speak of Black Americans as a group distinct from and apart from the American people. Thus, Buckley could say, using the archaic language of the 1965 resolution, and I'm quoting here, "The fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature and is the generosity, is the decency of the American people." Baldwin replied in the same style. "It seemed to me," he said, "when I watched Americans in Europe, that what they didn't know about Americans, that what they didn't know about Europeans, they didn't know about me." Both of them separated one group of Americans from all the rest. And it is this mode of thinking that needs to be hauled before you for cross-examination today. At the Cambridge University debate, Baldwin said, and I'm paraphrasing, of himself, projecting himself into the past, "I picked the cotton and carried it to market. I built the railroad under someone else's whip." Now that's all true, but it's not all the truth. He could also have said, "He prayed to God in words that provide all Americans with their spiritual vocabulary in time of trouble. He carried the rifle that preserved the Union from civil war. He wrote the music that defines America to the world. He cast the vote that made America a democracy at last. He provided the American dream with the most eloquent of its prophets and the most numerous of its martyrs." Now, some deny all this. They say land grabbing was real, enslavement was real, the dead bodies of strikers at Homestead and Ludlow were real, Japanese internment camps were real, the rest just fantasy. But the American dream did not merely flit across human minds in half-awake hours. It was articulated in words, inscribed in declarations, constitutions, amendments, statutes. That dream of a country in which all people could achieve themselves and be met with respect, that dream was recognized as real too, a power that could constrain power. The truth of this dream, the truth of this thing that was imagined but also inscribed into documents, the truth of this dream propelled millions of human beings to work and fight and suffer and endure. And that dream is propelling you too, right now. If it didn't, you would not be participating in this event today. Why would you bother? If land grabbing and enslavement and internment camps were the whole of the story, there would be hardly any point wasting breath to tell that story. Oppression and exploitation have been the shared experience of the vast, overwhelming majority of humanity since the invention of agriculture. Life for just about everyone, just about everywhere, was an experience of domination, backed by the threat of violence. Rulers against ruled, owners over slaves, men toward women, priests upon worshippers. Imagine the world in the year 1492, and except on the nomadic fringes of settled societies, it is all one unbroken stretch of mastery and subordination. The subordinated did not always accept their lot. Sometimes they rebelled, but they usually lost. And on the rare occasions when they won, they used their victory to subordinate someone else in turn. There seemed no way to escape this cycle of mastery, no concept of what an alternative might even look like. But over the past half millennium, a vision of something different coalesced, at first slowly, fitfully, uncertainly, then quickening into a revolutionary force. Here, in what would become the United States, a critical mass of people began to think that domination was not only wrong, but avoidable. And not only for themselves, personally, and their families, but for everybody. They may have held that thought inconsistently. If you wish, you can say hypocritically. But when they set the thought in writing, they wrote it for everyone, without qualification, without exception. That first flash of the idea of universal liberty sparked a fire that warms the world to this day. The American dream is not a dream only for Americans, or dreamed only by Americans. We could list many non-Americans who have worked and fought for their own versions of the idea articulated by James Truslow Adams without ever knowing that such a person as James Truslow Adams ever lived or would ever live. But even non-Americans recognize something distinctively American about the dream, which is why the phrase American dream resonates around the world, even in countries which may, at a particular moment, be doing a better job realizing the dream than Americans themselves. What those other people around the world recognize is that Americans were the first to set a public standard by which the ruled could judge the rulers, equal to equal. That was a new idea in the history of the world in 1776. And it does not matter that those who pledged themselves to the idea did not fully see or fully reckon with all of its radical implications. Creators seldom understand the magnitude of their creations. Only once a commitment is pledged does the commitment's full demand become apparent. People can default on their commitments. They often do. But when they uphold them, as Americans have returned again and again to the struggle to uphold their founding commitment, the upholding changes them forever and changes the world around them too. When you judge this country, you judge it by the measure that the founding ideals of this country put in your hand. When you reform this country, you reform it by tools that this country's own history provided to you. To deny the American dream is to deny yourself not only the right, but the ability to critique and perfect the America in which you live. As you vote on this resolution today, I hope you will not consider this discussion some kind of contest between Professor Muhammad and myself, or between the ghosts of James Baldwin and Bill Buckley. I hope you will consider this resolution as a statement by you, about you. If you vote yes, you're voting to separate Black Americans from their country. You are saying that America is one thing, African Americans are something different, that the relationship is antagonistic, that something called American can thrive when, or because, Americans of African descent do not thrive. I think this idea is not only morally wrong, I think this idea is logically impossible. When the resolution was presented in Britain in 1965, the students at Cambridge University voted overwhelmingly in the affirmative. Probably they were voting a compliment to James Baldwin, whose eloquence that day still reverberates. But possibly they were also revealing a lack of understanding of what a country 3,000 miles away from them across a great ocean can mean, should mean, must mean to all its people of all backgrounds, all creeds, all ethnicities, all races. When you vote no, you are recognizing African American political, cultural, economic, and moral power, and acknowledging that with power comes a responsibility to use that power for good. When you vote no, you are affirming that the American dream was dreamed by African Americans too, and that to the extent it has been realized, African Americans led the way. When you vote no, you are rebuking every cynic, every abstainer, every quitter. When you vote no to the resolution, you are saying yes to the struggle for a better country and a better world. I ask you to vote no.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frum. Now we'll begin our cross-examination period, and the first cross-examination will be by Trey Edgerton of Professor Muhammad. So let me tell you a little bit about Trey. Trey is an honors senior political science legal major and legal communications minor at Howard University by way of St. Paul, Minnesota. A student leader, he serves as the Howard University Student Association Civic Engagement Coordinator and president of the Howard University Speech and Debate Team. A proud and active member of the NAACP and College Democrats of America, he has dedicated his life to service and community action. When he is not running around to his various activities, he enjoys writing poetry, teaching, and grassroots organizing. Trey has received many awards for his various endeavors. He was a national finalist in the HBCU Speech and Debate National Tournament and champion in original oratory at the Harvard National Speech and Debate Tournament. He was named a global scholar and elected student council representative for the Council on International Education Exchange during his time abroad in Spain, Italy, and England. After his time at Howard, he plans to obtain a joint Master's of Divinity and Juris Doctorate degree as he pursues a career in civil rights law and ministry. He believes that it is our duty as a nation to build up every child from every background and will not stop until his goal, this American dream, has been achieved. Trey, it's an honor to welcome you.
Thank you so very much. And I just want to shout out to Dr. Khalil Muhammad on a excellent speech. So the first thing I want to bring up is that you mentioned a lot about economic discrepancies between Black and white Americans. And you even say that there would be no American dream without the exploitation of Black labor. Would Black capitalism or Black wealth be a solution to systematic racism, to these discrepancies, if it contributes to this system, continued system of capitalism within itself, holds roots in white supremacy and continuing and perpetuating that?
Thank you, Trey. And what an impressive resume. So it's a real honor to meet you. I've been a fan of the Howard debate team, and especially taking on and investing my current employers' students, although some of them might be upset with me for that. In any case, this question is a wonderful question to engage on this issue of the base of the superstructure of our economy. And that is, can Black people who achieve within a capitalist construct at the highest level reform or reflect the best of this system? The good news is that the answer to that question is borne out by a lot of federal policy beginning in the 1970s under the Richard Nixon administration that was termed Black capitalism. And a lot of private sector employers pursued hiring Black people into leadership positions, often at the assistant manager role, and or lending money, as financial service firms did, to set up Black small businesses. And indeed, one could argue that the mainstay of Black capitalists who over-index in, say, the Republican Party today come out of that tradition of pursuing their own economic fortunes within the system. The problem is, of course, that that system has been insufficient to overturn the generations of exploitation that continue to define Black people as essential workers in an economy that thrive on maldistribution of its public goods and resources. So the response to your question is, mostly Black capitalists have sat at the table of domination without changing what's on the menu. And the degree to which corporations, like some of our banks that were involved in the Great Recession, had high-ranking Black officials and middle managers who signed off on various policies that would ultimately saddle Black people with subprime mortgages and loans, demonstrates perhaps more than any other in our most recent time that just because you try to play this game as it has been designed doesn't mean that you can liberate your people as a result.
Okay, thank you for that answer. My next question, you speak of the white picket fence and house as synonymous to the American dream. And you even go on saying that the systematic gatekeeping of the suburbs causes this affluent white community to grow wealth, leaving Black people to be in inner city ghettos. And of course, there are crime and other economic issues going on there. So I'm from the suburbs of St. Paul, Minnesota. I was the only Black male in my class and often subject to comments about the predestined fate of Black people. So would you say that the current suburban communities, would they be accepting of Black people joining their communities? And what kind of policy changes would be needed to start that trend that would actually be passed in a bipartisan Congress so that we get Black people to achieve this American dream by being accepted into the suburbs?
So it's a very timely question, given that under the previous administration, certain fair housing rules were put in place to require local officials to make available land and development that would accommodate low income, often low-income Black and brown people and other people of color. The current administration has rescinded that rule as recently as 2018, and the referendum on this election very much turns on this question. But to raise a larger issue, and that larger issue is that often white Americans who imagine the suburb for the past 40 years, some of that has shifted and changed as younger whites have moved back into cities. But let's just take the trend lines over the last 4 decades, often imagine that not only were they entitled to a kind of negative freedom, which meant the freedom to keep other people out because they were entitled to have all white communities, but that the economics of that affluence were part of social policy and redistribution from the federal government to those white families at the direct expense of using those same dollars in efforts to rebuild the cities or to build public housing or to provide the same exact benefits to Black Americans as well. So if the question is, what is possible in our current environment, our current climate, it turns out that the suburbs are in fact more diverse. Some of the fastest growing census tracts are of people of color, often immigrant, Caribbean descendant, or African descendant. And many of those census tracts are beginning to index as low income, precisely because the wealth inequality and the economic inequalities that continue to ravage Black and brown communities are there. So whites will have to make room for their neighbors, find peace with them, and to resist the temptations of various white flight efforts that might see them either going back to the cities as gentrifiers or moving further and further out to rural America.
Okay, and then one follow-up. Integration, or the idea of moving in, a Black person moving into a white neighborhood, wasn't something that all Black people agreed upon. In fact, it was the Montgomery bus boycotts. Their initial goal was to simply have separate buses with better resources, and they wanted to continue on the tradition of segregation, although truly insinuating separate but equal. So what if Black people don't want to live or interact with white people, or vice versa? We are not a political or ideological hegemony. So what does a reimagined American dream look like? And how can us as Black Americans create, visualize, and put into practice a Black American dream, free from any sort of white ideological framework or Eurocentric sort of value criterion?
Your question reminds me of a decision that David Frum's former Atlantic colleague and writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, made when he initially decided to buy a home in the last several years. He first thought he might live in the suburbs and pivoted quite quickly, if I'm remembering the story that he shared, because he decided that for his own health and sanity, living among white people in this case was not the best for him and his family. And so he made a decision not to do so. I think that the country's a big place, Trey, and either by design or by choice, in some cases, Black people are, as individuals, making those choices. The problem, of course, is not simply the individual choice or even an idealized, utopic Black community. Prince George's County, for example, might be the closest one could say by dint of choice, by proximity to the nation's capital and the professional civil service work that often shapes the economic fortunes of those communities, and being the wealthiest county for Black homeowners in the country. And yet, and still, in those communities, Black people do not control their fate entirely. They are still subjected to criminal justice practices, and policing agencies, even when leadership is Black, are accountable to county systems and ultimately to state law and politics that prevent Black folks on their best day from doing right by their people or to enacting the political choices that those people want in terms of how they want to be policed. Black people cannot wall themselves off in segregated, idealized suburban or inner city communities as if they live separate and apart from a financial system that isn't just nationally defined, is globally defined. The supply chain networks, as we have noted in this corona pandemic, means that we are literally all in this together, life and death. And so no matter how much we might imagine a perfect community of Black autonomy, we do not live in a world where such can be achieved. And in a nation whose demographics of a white majority will give way to a brown majority, the thing that we have to hope for is that Black and brown people will not produce the same measures of exploitation and extraction and domination as individuals at the top, if they happen to be elites or political leaders, that their white counterparts have long done for the past several hundred years.
Okay, well, that's all that I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edgerton, Professor Muhammad. Those were excellent questions and really, really helpful responses. We now will have an opportunity to meet our other cross-examiner, Michael Franklin, who will be questioning Mr. Frum. Michael Franklin is a senior legal communications major at Howard University by way of Kansas City, Kansas. That's right, the one in Kansas, not the one in Missouri. And he serves as the 60th Howard University Student Association Executive Vice President. Michael has a dense and diverse resume, working with Fenway Strategies as a speechwriting intern, along with previously teaching alongside professors at Stanford Law, working with the Financial Integrity Network and the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Michael organized the inaugural Black Speechwriters Symposium held at Howard University, and he is the two-time national champion debater for the HBCU National Speech and Debate League. Michael lives by the quote from Minneapolis City Councilwoman Andrea Jenkins. Here's the quote: "My ancestors were enslaved in this country, and they hoped and prayed that someday somebody like me would be able to have a role in shaping how we live. Now that dream has come to fruition. And even though we have a long way to go, we must hope that we will reach our goals. Otherwise, why get out of bed in the morning?" Mr. Franklin, you now have the floor.
And thank you all for having me. And thank you, Mr. Frum, for providing your perspective in today's debate. And as a debater and also as a budding speechwriter, I love being able to dip a further bit into the arguments that were provided here today.
Thank you.
So getting right into it, one of the things that you mentioned were that Black Americans are the dream's test. And I think it's clear that America has failed that test. In a world that creates a dream to support and represent everyone based on achievement, how do we reconcile a dream that has caused so much harm with no reward to be inclusive with Black Americans in the future?
Has the dream caused harm? I mean, the dream of a possibility for each person to realize themselves. The American dream has driven American history, for better and for worse, even before the formal founding of the country, even before its independence. So that is what people thought they glimpsed here. And the holding of the country to its conscience has been a work which was so often led by secular and religious preachers from Black America, who challenged the country to be itself. They said, "You have written, these are the commitments you yourself have made." I just think that when you speak as you have done, that you are encouraging a council of despair. I mean, to say that it is, I mean, here we are gathered together at the, under the auspices of this great event. Here we are speaking with debaters from one of America's leading universities here in Washington, in a country that is so different in so many ways from what it was in 1965. To wish all of that away, I understand that the fear that if you acknowledge progress, if you acknowledge change, you somehow lose some of the urgency for work that you think remains unfinished. But my reading of human psychology says that the mood of despair, which is there in a lot of the writing of James Baldwin, and which has come more and more to the fore in a lot of the journalism and intellectual writing of the past decade, wasn't there, I think, so much more than 10 years ago, but especially the past 10 years, you've heard it so much. That is not actually inculcating urgency. That is teaching despair. And I think one of the questions that I think we all struggle with, and we are speaking at a high level, but to move sort of the immediate decisions we face, is the urgent predicament of the country right now in some ways was precipitated by the abstention of so many Black Americans from the voting process in 2016. That's one of the defining facts. The 2016 election is Black turnout dropped from where it was in 2012, and admittedly 2012 was a record, and it especially dropped in the Midwest, and it especially dropped in Michigan. There are many reasons for that, and there are policies that made it harder for people to vote. But the thing that sends people out to do collective things is a belief in their own power, and the significance of what they do, and their possibility. People are motivated by hope, not by despair. And I don't know that, I think it's false to say that, to say the way that you have done, that the dream has failed utterly for Black Americans. It's just, I think that's just, you could pile up statistics, but I don't want to make this a contest of statistics, because I think each of us know it's just not true. You look around the world that you live in, and to the extent that it's not fully achieved, the response should be to measure the distance to go by the distance you've come, and by the distance we've all come, and not to let the carrion comfort of despair make you passive.
And I appreciate that response. And I also want to push a bit on that follow-up in terms of despair versus realism, because you mentioned the belief of our own power. Mm-hmm. And to look around the world that I live in, and in the world that I live in, I see segregation of school districts. I see white flight versus gentrification that leads to going to schools with significant disparities based on the race of students who attend those schools. I see unarmed Black people who are dying in the streets without facing proper due process or a proper jury. And I see those folks not receiving the access to the American dream that is articulated upon by that you mentioned. And so I don't see that as falling into despair. Rather, I see it as realism. And so I would like to ask is that in order to have a real perception of the American dream, particularly how do we reconcile the consistent harm that is going on and consistent harm that has happened in the past towards Black Americans in order to create the invigoration that the American dream is something that can be accessible to Black America?
Okay, so you see what you see. I'm not going to gainsay what you see. Once you see it, how do you know it's wrong? On what basis do you indict it as wrong? As I stressed in these comments, I mean that the experience of mastery and domination was the universal experience of all of humanity in every place where there was settled civilization, except on the nomadic fringe, until very, very recently in the history of the human race. This is the curse of agriculture, and it brought with it societies that rested on, as Professor Muhammad said, the extraction of labor, and the rule of some over others. Rulers overruled, men over women, priests over worshipers. How do you know that that's wrong? It's only wrong because people began to have an idea that not only should it be different, but it could be different. And every time you speak up, every time you make a claim, you're making it on the basis of some right that you can only imagine because of the kinds of beliefs that together we call the American dream. Because you think it's wrong for some to be treated differently from others, because you think it's wrong for the ruled to be victims of arbitrary violence by employees of the rulers. You think those things, and where do you get those ideas? Those are the American dream. You are the conscience you voice is the product of the history in which you live. And it is a history, as I say, it's not only American, but it started here and it was fought for hardest here. And here's the place where very possibly its ultimate fate is going to be decided.
And so I appreciate that response. And for the final question of this cross-examination, I want to delve a bit into goes into the terminology of American within American dream. And I appreciate your mention of James Truslow Adams and the background in coining the term of the American dream. And through a part of that background was that it is stated that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. Yet America, since its foundations, did not even include Black Americans as a part of that everyone. In fact, Black Americans were considered as property. And so when it comes to the foundations of America, how can this dream account for everyone when for the longest, Black Americans were either counted as property directly or they were counted as 3/5 of a person? And we still continue to see today, even in regard to trying to count Americans on the census, that we see Black and brown Americans aren't included within those numerations or within that count, to where there's a lack of recognition for Black and brown folks as Americans. So how can we go back to this dream as being inclusive and supporting the ideology and visibility of Black and brown Americans when there has been a continued track record that simply does not view Black and brown Americans as a part of that everyone that can access this dream?
The man who wrote the words of 1776, all men are created equal, obviously didn't live by that creed himself. But he wrote those words, and he wrote them without exception, and he wrote them without qualification. And as a emerging writer yourself, you'll recognize that when you write something, the moment you write it, it escapes your control. The words have an existence independent from you. The commitment that Jefferson and the people who approved his declaration made escaped them. They didn't understand all of its implications. And if they did understand them, they maybe didn't accept them. But the country began reckoning with them, and reckoning with them very, very quickly. In the first decade of American independence, a number of the states abolished slavery. They were states usually with small slave populations, but the abolition came in the northeastern part of the United States. New York, which had a more significant slave population, followed a half generation later. And based on the commitments articulated in the founding of the country, beginning in the 1840s, the country began to be moved by one of the first of the great reform movements that has periodically surged through American life, the abolition movement. The country was torn apart by a civil war over the slavery issue. And grappling with the discrepancy between the country's founding commitments and the country's present realities has been the great motor of American life. And the point of this resolution is not to give Americans a moral blank check or pat on the back. It's not to engage in self-congratulation. Another phrase that I've been interested in, have written about, and I'm writing more about recently, the phrase American exceptionalism did not begin as a compliment. American exceptionalism began as a criticism that America was not doing it right, was diverging from the example of other countries. But in the commitments that America made at the beginning, that Americans made, they set in motion something that has changed the whole planet. And when you say, as this resolution does, when you invite people to say, I reject the dream, it's at the expense of an important part of the country, it's a false, it's a lie, then the question is, what are you left with by which to change the country? If you reject its founding commitment, then you actually reject the possibility of criticizing it, because there's, in a funny way, in the rejection is a statement that is so optimistic as to be almost naive, that though if you reject it, you believe it's just so obviously wrong that human beings should be one on top of another, should one exploit another, that we don't need the particular history of the United States to understand that. It's just obvious. And I say, if it was obvious, how come nobody before the United States ever seemed to think of it ever anywhere, or anyway could make it stick? What America changed was not only that people had this idea, but people believed it was possible, first for themselves, but they wrote it bigger, and then for others. And as their words bound them, they set in motion events that changed the country. And we still grapple with this, even now. I've written a lot about this myself, and you have, and Professor Muhammad has. But without those words, where would we be? The values you want to maintain are not so obvious. We're not so obvious. We're not self-executing. Something had to happen to make them true. And it was the American dream that was that something that began the process of making them true.
Now that's all the time I have.
Thank you.
I appreciate but disagree with your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin, Mr. Frum. I want to take this time now to thank everyone, Professor Muhammad, Mr. Frum, Mr. Edgerton, Mr. Franklin. You have given us all a lot to think about, and more importantly, you've all given us reason to go beyond just thinking to action to bring about justice in this world. As I hand it back over to Isisara, I also want to say an additional thank you to her and the other organizers of this event and the sponsors of this event. This festival is just incredible, and I'm just so honored to be a part of it. Isisara, thank you so much.
It's been a delight having you. Thank you. You may know her as Zoe Johnson or television's Blackish and Grownish, but actor Yara Shahidi is also a formidable activist. In high school, she started Yara's Club, a partnership with the Young Women's Leadership Network. For her birthday in 2018, she launched 18 by 18 to encourage civic engagement and voting in young people. Her social justice work includes the groups Girls for Gender Equality and the Third Wave Fund. We asked Yara to give us her thoughts on the impact of James Baldwin, his writings, legacy, and that of this debate on this rising generation of leaders. Here now is Yara Shahidi.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to Isisara for inviting me into this conversation and for this beautiful reimagining of such an important debate. I want to start by really broadly talking about why I've resonated with Baldwin since I first opened Sonny's Blues, the first short story of his that I read, and how his voice, not only as a thought leader, but that of a poet and of a connector and community builder, has really helped usher me into finding my own political voice. I remember when I was 14 reading Sonny's Blues for the first time, and what struck me was the fact that the way he portrayed our Black community was not in a way that ever erased the trauma that we went through or the oppression, but it was in a way that gave light to our magnificence, to our culture, to our beauty, and to our love. There was something about being able to hold both of these truths that felt so impactful to me. And when I later went on to read Notes of a Native Son and his other texts, I really felt as though that theme carried out throughout all of his work. I can point to essays from The Devil Finds Work. I can point to Giovanni's Room as other pivotal moments in which he helped me articulate things that I couldn't personally find the words for. I think of his role as really a self-described big brother of the movement. Listening to him talk about his connection, both figuratively and literally, to Dr. King, to the many people that surrounded him. I even really recall with such a deep gratitude watching the I'm Not Your Negro documentary. And there was something that really struck me when he said that he was coming back from Paris because he watched his little brothers die. He's referring to the assassination of Medgar Evers and Dr. King and Malcolm X, and that impactful moment in which he felt it was his basic kind of blood responsibility to be there for the rest of his family. And when I think of how Baldwin's work is really translated into this moment right now, I really couldn't think of a figure who has more perfectly set the foundation for us to be able to articulate the absurdity of what's going on. Oftentimes when I read his work, it feels as though it was written this past week. Jimmy's Blues, a collection of poems, almost scarily accurately describes not only our situation in terms of international relations, but the national strife that we're going through. But to, for a second, really turn to why we're here, to talk about the importance of this debate, and I so appreciate the points made by Professor Muhammad in referencing and astutely connecting what Baldwin is talking about to what we are going through. I remember turning to this debate as one of the first times I had actually heard James Baldwin speak. I'm fortunate that there's so many recordings of him, but this was a long format moment in which he really honestly and authentically was able to voice his opinion, as well as the opinion that you see in so much of his literature. And the central theme of the American dream, I think, couldn't be more fitting. It is a question that we are asking ourselves right now. whether the American dream was meant for us. And I feel as though we have arrived at the conclusion that the way it is currently structured, it is not. But then it begs the next question. What work has to be done in order to achieve a sense of a dream that has us in mind? The quote that I reference, and I actually challenge myself not to say it sometimes because I reference it so many times in my life, is at the beginning of the debate when Baldwin speaks, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but when he says that everything you've seen is white and therefore you assume that you are too, it comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 that the flag that you pledged allegiance to, along with everybody else, did not pledge allegiance to you. That Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, when you thought you were Gary Cooper, you are the Indians. And then he speaks of the turmoil that happens when you've gone through a process of American racism that is so fatiguing that you have lost hope by the age of 30 and have none to pass on to your children. And it feels like such an important articulation of what's happening. Whether you point to Kaepernick and literal displays in which our country is saying that we are disrespecting its flag, when we have seen time and time again how the flag and the country associated with it has never respected us. There's something really powerful about the mission statement in that sentiment of saying, what does it look like to be a part of a country that has pledged allegiance to us? In many ways, that's been my own anchoring mission through media and through everything else I do, is figuring out how to explore worlds in which we can begin to pledge allegiance to our many communities, in which we can be identity celebratory. And then when you get to the question of the fatigue that we feel, the response that I hear is, how do we instate joy? How do we create a sustainable movement such that we're not experiencing that level of fatigue? Because the unfortunate truth is, as it's been said by speakers before me, is that we are enduring some of the exact same themes. We are witnessing mass incarceration such that we can have 25% of the world's mass incarcerated peoples, but only 6% of the world's population. The experience of witnessing overt visual displays of violence against Black and brown people means that the very situation that we're in feels like a paradox, to be reminded every moment that you are living that this country had no intention to foster your life. And so when I look at what Baldwin offers us in this debate, as much as it is depressing at times, as much as I get chills, as much as I end the debate thinking, where do we go from here? What is great about how he phrases things is that whether he clearly says it or not, it feels as though he is leaning towards an answer. He is ushering us towards a solution. And when I'm looking at the movements that we've seen, months of protests that we've seen even this summer, and I look at the young people that are leading the movement, I see Baldwin in their action. First and foremost, because behind every movement, if I were to point particularly to Black Lives Matter, is the essence and the essential need to build community. And I feel as though Baldwin represents the building of community to me, because he has been the entry point for me to learn about so many other pivotal civil rights figures, because he was so deeply connected to them and felt such a deep relationship. And so not only do I see the fact that our generation is taking on his sentiment by building community, I also see that our generation is orienting their skills and passions towards social justice in a way that I think Baldwin has really set the blueprint for. It is no longer a matter of protesting the same, but it is a matter of leveraging our skills and what we have to offer to figure out the most poignant way for us to be a part of this moment of fighting for equity. Baldwin said that the poet often has some of the most appropriate answers and the appropriate ability to actually assess our human condition. This is something that can sometimes feel like an oxymoron, because how is it that in the arts, so often viewed as detached, from the world itself that we find the actual answers to the world that we're living in. But Baldwin reminds us that it is through art. It is through art that is anchored in our reality that we begin to not only assess what is happening, but begin to envision and create the dialogue and verbiage to reimagine a future that we have no grounding for. I say all of that to say that I am a big fan of this debate and what we can learn from it. And I feel as though every time I make reference to it, I learn something new. I'm so grateful to be here and to have shared even just a little bit of how I feel about Baldwin, about this pivotal moment. I hope you all enjoy the rest of what this program has to offer.
Thank you, Yara, and deepest thanks to everyone involved in this Baldwin-Buckley debate reimagined. In times such as these, even voicing one's opinion in a calm and generous manner takes courage. All of our presenters today certainly have that. Be sure to take your time going through the March on Washington Film Festival website. We have a treasure trove of documentary and short films, roundtable discussions, educational resources, reading lists, and even an interactive quiz to test your knowledge of civics, history, and current events. And all of it is suitable for most ages. So until we meet again, march on.
Kick